Welcome to the Irish Aviation Authority's Lunchtime Lecture Series, So You Got a Drone, Now What? I'm very happy to be joining you today. My name is David Hansel, and I am a UAS inspector here in the Irish Aviation Authority's UAS division. And today we're going to be discussing a really important topic, which is, so you got a drone, now what? This is for the first-time users of drones, folks who just received a drone as a gift or finally made that big purchase, and the first thing they want to do is get that drone in the sky. But before you do that, there are some things you need to do to ensure that you're flying safely and in full compliance with the regulations. So we're going to touch on those today. And as we always do, we're going to start with the regulations in aviation, which underpin safety. We're going to talk about the systems that we use here at the Irish Aviation Authority to help individuals interact with the regulatory environment by registering as a UAS operator and training as a remote pilot. We'll talk about insurance, and then we'll touch briefly on your obligations both as a UAS operator and a remote pilot, where you can and cannot fly, and how you should be thinking about safety, reporting, and our views on what we call just culture in aviation safety, which is a really important point across the aviation community. As I mentioned, aviation is a very, very highly regulated industry. The regulation that we look to primarily here in the drone space, which you'll be subject to as a remote pilot and as a UAS operator, is Regulation 2019-947. This is the rules and procedures for the operation of unmanned aircraft. In total, it's about 500 pages worth of legal requirements. We'll distill those down to make them a little more consumable and relevant for these first-time users. We'll also touch on Regulation 785-2004, which are the insurance requirements for air carriers and for aircraft operators. And we'll touch briefly on 2018-1139, which are the common rules in the field of civil aviation. In order for you to begin interacting with the regulatory environment, sort of from a paperwork perspective, we do need you as a new UAS operator to create an account within MySRS. MySRS is the database that the Irish Aviation Authority uses for all aviation professionals across the Republic of Ireland, air traffic control officers, pilots of traditional air carriers, UAS operators, engineers. They all register within the MySRS system in order to monitor and track their certifications and their legal requirements for registration. It's a way for you to interact not just with the environment here in Ireland, but across all EASA member states, because we all have the same obligation to adhere to 2019-947. So if you go to our website, iaa.mysrs.ie, you'll see at the bottom, don't have an account, sign up now. Click there. You'll have the opportunity to provide your information. We will ask for some identity verification documentation. This is so that we can be compliant with GDPR and ensure that the person who is registering is the person who is registering. And once you do that and get that all verified, you can begin your journey of registering as a UAS operator. And this is really step one before you put that drone up in the sky, is getting your UAS operator registration. We go to 2019-947, particularly Article 14, describes two conditions under which you have to register as a UAS operator. And I can tell you now from experience, the overwhelming majority of people who fly drones in Ireland meet one of these two requirements. The first, if your drone weighs more than 250 grams, you must register. The second, if it happens to be one of those drones that are built to be under 250 grams, which a lot of them are these days, if that drone is equipped with a sensor able to capture personal data, so a camera, then you also have to register. Again, this is 99.99% of drones that are out there on the market today. There is a small exception defined in 2009-48, and that is for toys, which are specifically marketed towards children under the age of 14. These are those drones that you just fly them around the house. They don't have a camera. They have a very simple remote control. They're not the thing that the bulk of us are taking outside and flying around the beach or doing wedding photography. That's not this. That is those small toy drones. So again, if you bought a new drone, if you went to a store, if you bought it online, odds are you do have to register as a UAS operator. We go to, again, that same regulation. We look at Article 14, and it tells us you have to register in the place where you have your residence for natural persons, or if you're a legal entity, a business, where your principal place of business is for legal purposes. If that's here in Ireland, Great, you can do all that on MySRS. This also includes people who are coming to visit Ireland as tourists from outside of an EASA member state, what is defined in a slightly different regulation as a third country. So if you're coming here on vacation, you do have this same obligation, and you can use Ireland as your place to register, even if you're going to travel after Ireland to other nations within the EASA member states. This registration is absolutely valid across that entire jurisdiction. And what'll happen after you do that is you'll get this UAS operator registration, and it'll have your name, the expiration date, and then you'll have this registration number. Mine's blurred out here, but it starts with IRL. Every nation within EASA has a different three-letter start, but you'll get one that says IRL, and there'll be 13 digits after that. You are required to affix that to your drone in a manner that is visible while the drone is sitting on the ground. You can purchase decals to do that. You can print your own decals if you want to. You can convert it to a QR code and affix it to the drone. You can even take a marker and you can just write it on there if you feel like it. As long as it's visible while it's landed on the ground, unaided, so without binoculars or a microscope, that is completely legal. And now the drone has passed that first requirement for getting up into the sky. There might be a second requirement, and that will depend on the kind of drone that you have and the kind of operations you want to conduct. The next thing you might have to do is obtain a remote pilot certificate of competency. If you think about the UAS operator registration as akin to a number plate on your car, this one is more akin to you getting a driving license. We again go to 2019-947, which defines what are called UAS operations in the open category. The open category is determined to be the lowest level of risk operations. And again, it is the bulk of the kind of flying that we see, not just here in Ireland, but pretty much globally when it comes to UAS operations. Pilots are keeping the drone within unaided visual line of sight so they can see it without binoculars. They're keeping it below 120 meters in altitude above ground level, and they're not overflying assemblies of people. Assemblies of people are defined by EASA as a group of people who, in the event your drone fell out of the sky, they wouldn't be easily able to move out of the way. So it's not just about the number of people, it's about how crowded the area is and what those people are doing. So if you're flying across a high street during shopping hours, that's an assembly of people. If you're flying over a sporting event, that's an assembly of people. If you're flying over a construction zone where the workers are engaged in an activity that is risky, and so they cannot divide their attention to watch your drone, that could be defined as an assembly of people, and you would not be able to operate your drone in that condition. The final point on that is that 120 meters. There are other restrictions that might keep you lower than that, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit in terms of geozone awareness. But the regulation says 120 meters above ground level. So if you're on the top of a mountain, it's 120 meters above the top of that mountain. If you're down in a valley, it's 120 meters above that valley floor where you are sitting. There is also an interesting carve out for operations within 50 meters laterally of an obstruction, such as a building or a tower, cell phone tower, where you can go 15 meters above the height, the top of that obstruction, if you are within 50 meters laterally of that. However, the caveat for that is that you must have the permission of the obstacle owner. So where we see this probably the most is pool bag stacks here in Dublin. People believe that if I stay within 50 meters of pool bag, I'm fine. I can go up above that, which pool bag is much higher than the restriction in that area allows. But the odds are you don't have ESB's permission, and therefore you cannot fly above the altitude restriction for that airspace, even if you're within 50 meters of that obstruction. And then we come to the question of, do I need a remote pilot certificate of competency? And that's actually very simple to determine. EASA instituted a C-class system for drones. You'll see here on this chart, they go up to C4. Technically, the chart goes up to C6, but 5 and 6 are just technical modifications. They're not weight changes, so they don't show this on this open chart. Odds are you're not ever going to encounter a C5 or 6 drone this early in your drone journey. You might, but it's probably unlikely. If you purchase a C0 drone, that 250 gram, well, less than 250 gram drone that I mentioned before, it's not by accident that a lot of those drones now have a max takeoff mass of 249 grams. You do not actually require a remote pilot certificate of competency. You must register, but you don't actually have to get in what's called the Open A1, A3 remote pilot certificate of competency. If your drone weighs 250 grams or more, you do require that because now you're in this C1 class of drone. We see a lot of drones in sort of this 750 to 800 gram range. Those are C1s. You go over that above 900 but less than 4 grams, you're now talking about C2 class drones. We see another big distribution of drones in that category there as well. And then anything above 4 to 25 kilograms, you're now talking about C3, C4 drones. All of those can be flown in the open category with an A1 or an A3 open subcategory remote pilot certificate of competency. If you want to obtain an A2, which gives you the ability to fly close to people but still not over assemblies of people, you can do that. And we wholeheartedly encourage people to get the highest level of training commensurate with their operational need. We think it makes better, safer pilots, but it's not an obligation for you to get an A2 simply because you have a C2 drone. In that case, it's about how you operate that drone. And most people can get by with an A1, A3 if their drone is over 250 grams. But again, we do wholeheartedly encourage people get as much training as possible. It makes for safer pilots. It makes for safer environments. And once you do that, you will receive a remote pilot certificate of competency or a remote pilot certificate of theoretical knowledge. This is a copy of mine here. And again, it has that identification number. And you'll note again, it starts IRL, but then it says RP, indicating remote pilot. This is how you differentiate between this document and your UAS operator registration. A lot of times we see drones with IRL RP on it. That's the wrong document. Understandable mistake. New people do it all the time. It's nothing to worry about, easily fixed. You'll also note on here that the level of certification you have is indicated on the right side in those boxes. Most people will just get this A1, A3, but you can continue on your educational journey in drones and get your A2 or get what's called your STS, which would allow you to conduct operations in the specific category, which is a higher level of risk. It's more complicated drone operations. And we do, again, encourage people to do that if their operational need necessitates that. The final thing that we will cover on these sort of big three initial things is insurance. We look to Regulation 785/2004, which is broken down a bit in UAS Advisory Memorandum 4. 785/2004 applies to all air carriers and to aircraft operators. UAM 004 explains then how does this apply to drones. And it basically says, if you have a drone with less than 20 kilogram maximum takeoff mass, if you are intending to only fly for sport or recreation, then you don't actually need third-party liability insurance. This is a very important distinction. A lot of people believe that if they're not flying to be paid for a specific flight, they're not servicing a customer, then they've not received any money, then they don't actually need insurance. But the delineation between whether or not you require insurance is not whether or not you are paid for that. It is whether or not you're doing it solely for the purposes of recreation. And if you are putting this on social media to gain followers, if you're putting this on social media and putting on your profile, DM me for wedding photography with a drone, you are not flying for recreation only. You are flying for non-recreation. So it's not commercial versus recreation. It is recreation and sport versus everything else. So if you're doing any sort of promotion, you would likely fall into the requirement to obtain third-party liability insurance. And quite frankly, I want insurance no matter what. Drones are expensive. If it falls out of the sky and breaks because the batteries fail, which does happen, I don't want to have to buy a new drone myself. They're expensive. And forbid I actually hit someone, that is an expensive mistake, and I don't want myself or that person to be on the hook financially for an inadvertent mistake. And finally, if the drone strikes a structure, especially if you're flying in a city center, and you bang into a building that happens to be under construction, I don't want to be liable for that. Interestingly, in a lot of these cases, when you have insurance coverage, if something happens, the first thing they will ask you for is please provide me with your UAS operator registration and, if appropriate, your remote pilot certificate of competency. So this is another case where you can see it is important to be appropriately certificated. It's important to be appropriately registered. So now that you've gotten the sort of paperwork out of the way, let's talk about your obligations both as an operator and a pilot. In the overwhelming majority of cases, you are serving legally as both the operator and the pilot. Think about a traditional air carrier. The operator is whatever airline you bought your ticket on, and the pilot is the person sitting in the flight deck. In the case of drones, an overwhelming majority of the time, as I said, you're both. The UAS operator is responsible for the overall conduct of the operation. The pilot is strictly responsible for the flying in that moment, controlling the aircraft as it's in the sky. But in the run-up to actually flying, the UAS operator does a bunch of things. They are responsible for knowing where they can and cannot fly. They are responsible for ensuring the pilot, which happens to be the same person in most cases, is appropriately certificated, trained to do what it is that they're about to do. They're responsible for ensuring the environment in which they are flying is safe to fly in. Those are UAS operator obligations, and those are defined in same regulation, 947, in UAS Open 050. And then what the remote pilot is expected to do is further defined in 060. You can find this regulation online here. You can also just do an internet search for regulation EU 2019-947. That website, that URL is the first thing that should come up when you do a search. Very easy to find. Again, almost 500 pages worth of really interesting, valuable knowledge in there. But for a new operator, the two main sections of your responsibility are boiled down into these two sections. And we'll start with the UAS operator as shown in 050. There's 7, although there are some subsections there, so you wind up with about 8 or 9 responsibilities that you have to do. Designate the remote pilot. Again, that's probably yourself. Ensure all operations are using radio spectrum efficiently. That is an obligation that you have as a UAS operator, not to interfere with other radio spectrum usage. But also determining where you are and are not allowed to fly and providing that data to the remote pilot is a really important function of the UAS operator. If you operate in an area, let's say you go out and fly in what turned out to be a red zone, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, you've actually committed 2 different violations because you possibly did not obtain the information in the first place, which you're obligated to do as an operator. And then when you flew in that zone, you as the remote pilot failed to adhere to the published restrictions. So you wind up committing 2 violations, whether deliberately or inadvertently. So attention to detail in this way is particularly important. It is interesting that the moment you put that drone in the sky, legally, you are a pilot. You are no different legally than an operator of, an Airbus 320 that's flying from Dublin across Europe. So the obligations for knowledge and for professionalism are very, very high, and we distill those down into these 2 sections particularly. Now we look again, 060. Big list of things that the remote pilot has to be responsible for, but basically operating in accordance with this regulation, operating safely and only operating where you can operate. The way you figure out where you can operate is a principle called Geozone Awareness. This is an obligation for UAS operators to be aware of, and for remote pilots to only operate within airspaces and restrictions where they are allowed to be. So Ireland is largely available for flight up to 120 meters without restrictions. However, as we'll see here in a moment, there is a map which defines areas which may be restricted where you can't go as high as 120. We see this a lot in proximity to airports. You obviously, the closer you get to the airport, the lower the aircraft are operating. So the necessity for you to be lower or to not be flying at all goes up the closer you get to an airport. But there are some zones that are established for safety or security or privacy purposes where you cannot fly for any reason whatsoever. This is Geozone Awareness boiled down into a simple talking point. It is knowing where you can fly and how you can fly when you're in certain areas. For many years, many drone systems had what was called geofencing, where the drone would not take off and if you were in an area where you weren't allowed to be. However, as we saw from those previous two slides about UAS and remote pilot responsibilities, there is no regulatory definition where the manufacturer is responsible for that knowledge. It falls down on two people, or just one person if you're operating as both. And so we still hear today, sometimes people will say, well, the drone didn't stop me from flying, so I assumed I was okay. Those systems have long been sunset, so that rationale does not stand any longer. The regulations are very clear. That's the UAS operator and the remote pilot ultimately responsible for that flying. But we're here to help with that. And the way that we do that is for the operator, we make the data available. It's published. And then for the remote pilot, that data is in a format that can be uploaded to your drone, to the drone controller specifically, but made available to the remote pilot so that they can adhere to those restrictions that the UAS operator has obtained for them. The way we do that is through a JSON file. The regulation obligates us to share this data in a agreed upon digital format. So we use JSON files. That is simply uploaded to your controller. You can find instructions on how to do that online for your particular model of drone. It's very, very simple. And then when you turn your drone controller on the next time, you'll see an overlay of these geozones, these green, amber, and red zones, warning you of what your obligations are within those airspaces. In addition to those, there are other restrictions around the country, whether those are general restrictions, whether those are data protection requirements, or whether those are environmental concerns, where you should not be flying. And there's links to that information at the bottom of this page that you as a UAS operator have to be aware of, and that you as a remote pilot have to adhere to when you are flying. So if NPWS has determined you shouldn't be flying in this coastal area because it is migration season or calving season for animals that are migrating along the western coast of Ireland, we see this a great deal. You shouldn't be flying there. That is an obligation that you must be aware of and that you must adhere to. Those are all contained here and available for you to utilize as an operator and as a pilot. Make it available to your pilots, adhere to it as a pilot. When you do that, the odds of you running foul of the regulations go down exponentially. This brings us to the final point about safety. Safety is everything in aviation. We operate today in the culmination of decades of learning about how to operate more safely. Our whole goal is to fly as safe as possible. The way we contribute to that is through a system of safety reporting where people, whether they are the general public here in Ireland, aircraft operators, pilots, air traffic controllers, engineers, you name it, if they see something that they believe to be unsafe, they have, in many cases, a legal obligation, but they definitely have a moral obligation to share that information with us. And the easiest way to do that is through the aviationreporting.eu website. We've recently modified this form to make it very accessible for UAS operators, for individuals to report unsafe UAS operations. What this is not, it is not a tool for us to initiate an investigation. This is a tool to allow us to collect, analyze, collate, and share air safety data so that if we are seeing trends emerge, we at the IAA and in partnership with aircraft operators, with drone users, with other regulators around the EU, with our air navigation service providers here in AirNav to develop systems or procedures to help mitigate those risks. And you can do that without fear of retribution at this aviationreporting.eu website, because everything we rely on in aviation safety reporting has to be paired with what we call a just culture approach to aviation safety. This is a cornerstone of who we are at the IAA and how we do business. We encourage open and honest reporting of incidents without fear of punishment for genuine mistakes. Mistakes happen, accidents happen. What we don't want to have happen is we ignore a mistake because we're scared that we're going to get in trouble for the mistake and it turns into an accident. So if you did something wrong, or if you saw someone do something wrong and it was just a genuine mistake, you're not going to get in trouble. That's not our job. We're going to help educate people. We're going to help stop that trend, and we're going to move on. If you do something willful, you deliberately go out and break the law, that's different. In those cases, we are going to do enforcement, but the principles of just culture still apply, such that we have a continuum of responsibility where we assess if you were willfully negligent, criminally negligent. Were you acting with deliberate disregard for safety? Or did you just need a bit of education? You just needed some help to do it more safely and do it better. That's our primary role here at the Irish Aviation Authority, not to bring people into the court system and get them in trouble for flying irresponsibly. That is certainly a tool that we have, and we have used it in cases where pilots have ignored the regulations and flown in spite of us telling them not to in certain cases. That is such the far end of the spectrum. It is an incredibly small percentage of the overwhelming majority of people who just want to fly safely, have fun, take some neat pictures, do some interesting FPV racing. They're never going to encounter us in an enforcement situation. What we do want to do is have them encounter us in an education system where everyone is getting better and everyone's getting safer, because we're willing to admit to making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And one of the best ways you can do that, obviously, that aviationreporting.eu website is available 24/7, and we do encourage people to submit to that. Finally, however, you can reach out to us directly at our website, ia.ie/drones, or email us directly. Questions, from the simplest questions about registration to the most complicated questions about enhanced containment for specific category operations, or you want to start a business taking pictures, or you want to do photogrammetry or surveying, quantity surveying, you name it. We are a resource to the public here in Ireland to help people achieve those goals with the maximum level of aviation safety. So please do reach out to us. Enjoy your time as a drone pilot and as a UAS operator, and fly safely. Thanks very much.